I'm Rendan, and this is the embarrassing, terrible Mortal Kombat Trilogy. One after the other.
I tire of maintaining our innocence.
I will relieve you of your burden.
Mortal Kombat is a video game. For those that don't know, Mortal Kombat is a 1v1 fighting game where you can select from a vast array of characters from a huge roster to fight against people. It's usually a game that you would see at like parties, unless you're really good at it, and then you play online, unless you want to get yourself killed. I haven't played Mortal Kombat in like decades, but from what I remember, it was mostly like a party game. You get your friends, you select your favorite characters, and then you just punch each other and do combos to beat each other. It's like Super Smash Brothers, but 1 versus 1 with much tighter controls. When you take that concept of two people in just a flat, almost two-dimensional looking arena where they just go left to right and try to make a movie out of that, there's not a whole lot of room for you to work. And that is pretty clear in the 1995 Mortal Kombat movie directed by notorious Hollywood hack Paul W.S. Anderson of the Resident Evil franchise fame. He's a terrible, terrible director, and this is a terrible, terrible movie.
This puny mortal will be no problem. I'll crush him in one blow.
All right. Let's dance.
I only watched it for the first time last night, and I honestly thought it was one of the worst movies I had seen in a long time until I watched Mortal Kombat Annihilation, which we'll talk about in a minute. But this is still not a very good movie, even compared to Mortal Kombat Annihilation, which is the worst movie I think I've ever seen in my whole life. It doesn't do a whole lot that well, but what it does well is really the only thing it needed to, which is the combat sequences, the hand-to-hand fight scenes. The choreography is solid, and that's really the only praise I can give this movie. Some of the sets, too, are all right, but its overuse of visual effects and CG and blue screen, green screen, make this movie horrifically dated. It's from '95, which is right around the time of Jurassic Park, and this movie uses 100 times more visual effects than Jurassic Park, which means they are given 100 times less time to do the visual effects. So you get these disgusting, horrible-looking visuals, horrible-looking CG creatures, horrible-looking CG backgrounds. It's an ugly, ugly movie, and the visual effects and the CG is not the only reason for this. The cinematography is ugly, the editing is ugly, it's kind of hard to follow too. Scenes will just happen and then end seemingly at random. The second act of this is a complete mess. It is literally scene after scene after scene of just an action scene happening and then an action scene happening, and they almost have no correlation to each other. There's no escalation between the action sequences. It is literally just one after another. You could just rearrange them in practically any order and almost nothing would change. And the first act is so thrown together and hastily assembled that it's very difficult to follow what's going on, who anyone is, or what anyone's motivation is. It's very difficult to follow that. It's very flimsy. The four-armed man, Prince Gugu Magugu, comes in, or whatever his name is, and he's like a terrible, embarrassing practical effect. I mean, generally, you want to make everything practical as much as you can in camera, but this just maybe not. Just, you know, have a guy with strings attached to floppy arms and move him around. Just get a tall guy or a buff guy to do that. It would look much better. It's so bad. It looks dreadful. So having him be a CG character in the new Mortal Kombat made a lot of sense, even though that doesn't look that great either, but we'll talk about it later. We'll talk about that later too. Anyway, so Mortal Kombat 95 is not a good movie by any stretch of the imagination. It's boring, it's stupid, and the characters aren't that interesting. They have these incredibly forced arcs where they have to face their true selves, which is basically them overcoming the only character trait that they have. One has trust issues. One feels bad that his brother died. He feels like he is responsible. And another is egotistical and vain. And they have to overcome that to win. So it's incredibly simple. It's very boilerplate. And it's so dated, it's hard to watch. It's an ugly movie, it's a stupid movie, and it is actually unintentionally funny in parts. So if you want to watch a movie with some friends, this one isn't a bad one to watch with friends, because it is unintentionally kind of stupid and funny, but it may not be worth watching for 90 minutes. I'd give this one a solid 2 out of 10. When I first saw it, I gave it a 1. Like, I really disliked it. But then we came to Mortal Kombat Annihilation. Wow. This is probably the worst big budget or mildly big budget movie that exists. I don't know of a worse one. It is just the most embarrassing movie I have ever seen. Every actor in this should be ashamed of themselves. Everyone that was a part of this should be ashamed of themselves. The story is completely different. The first one was about people going to a tournament and fighting other people to decide the fate of the world. Super simple. It's basically the same type of premise that the third one has. Again, we'll talk about that. But this time, apparently the evil overlord of the Outworld area, which was trying to invade Earth, invades Earth. And he brings an army of goons with him to invade Earth. And one of the people from the first movie, Katana, gets kidnapped, and they have to try and save her, because apparently she's the key to all of this, if we could get her working. But this movie, from like, in the first 5 minutes, it blew its wad, and it was shockingly bad. The first 5 minutes is visual effects heavy, combat heavy, but in a really ham-fisted and horrible, embarrassing way. It looks awful. All of the visual effects in this are significantly worse than the first one, which is shocking. The acting is significantly worse than the first one, and they even recast like main actors from the first one in the same role, and it's like painfully obvious. They didn't even really try. They all are really bad in it. The comedy falls flat, and it tries to be comedic a lot, which is unfortunate.
You've been tricked.
You will die for this, Jade.
And that's mainly why I can't say that this is worth seeing as like a so bad it's good movie. It is just boring and stupid and embarrassing. I know I've said that a lot, but that is the best way to describe it. It constantly is trying to be like a comedic movie with this weird, almost dark tone. It completely clashes with itself, and it makes for a really uncomfortable experience that I didn't enjoy watching. There's nothing really redeeming about this. It's not fun. It's not funny. It is just like a slog. It's a miserable slog. It's poorly edited. It's poorly shot. Everything about it is bad. Everything about it is bad. There's no character arcs this time. Things just sort of happen seemingly at random. Characters move from one place to another. There's backstabs that don't even feel like they matter. There's action that's filmed and edited significantly worse than the original. It's just an all-around dreadful, awful, awful movie that no one should ever watch. Like, I'm serious. You should not watch this. It is hard to get through. And now I know there are other Mortal Kombat titles between this movie and Mortal Kombat 2021, but I didn't watch any of them because they're not live-action movies, and I don't care about the TV show. So yeah, there's that Scorpion's Revenge animated thing, and there's like a TV show from 2011, as well as some other things here and there. But I didn't care about any of that. I just watched the movies, and so that brings us to the 2021 movie, which is the best of the trilogy, even though the bar is incredibly low. It manages to hop way over that incredibly low bar. And that's not to say it's a good movie, don't get me wrong. It's not a very good movie. In fact, I think it's intensely mediocre. And for that quality, it might be the least memorable out of these three movies. I mean, in terms of the action, in terms of how graphic and violent it is, it's memorable for that. But everything else about it is so forgettable and bland, it's actually kind of interesting. All it had to do was have graphic violence. That's all that anybody that's a fan of Mortal Kombat wants, is incredibly graphic violence. At least it did that, and there were some genuinely really fun action sequences and these gory kills. There's one where a guy uses his hat to saw a lady in half, and I know it's a visual effect, but it was a fun kill. It was a fun sequence. A lot of the hand-to-hand combat sequences were really entertaining as well. They're very well choreographed. There's some really talented martial artists in this. One of the guys from The Raid is in this as Sub-Zero. So there's some really well done action sequences in this movie, really well choreographed action sequences, and even shot. There's some pretty good looking cinematography in this. There's some nice sets, nice production design, nice costumes. It's a pretty good looking movie overall in terms of a Mortal Kombat movie. And again, the bar is so embarrassingly low, but it actually operates as a high budget blockbuster movie. And for that, I give it a lot of credit because I expected this movie to be terrible. The trailers didn't look great. It looked like an over-the-top CGI nightmare, and at times it was, which is my biggest problem with it. The whole point of this movie for me was to watch a bunch of disgusting, sickening kills. And that's even what they marketed it as. There's so many interviews and articles written about how graphic it is. I've heard people literally say they've heard it's the most gruesome, violent movie of all time, and to them I said, I doubt it. And that's sort of one of my problems with it, is it is very violent and it is very graphic, but it doesn't push it that far. Aside from a couple of pretty gory kills, like a lady getting sawed in half, a lot of it is visual effects, and it doesn't look great. There's one where a guy smashes a guy's head like a tomato, and it just doesn't look very good, and it's not satisfying. I rewatched The Raid, at least scenes from The Raid and The Raid 2 after watching this, because those scenes are brutal. They're violent, they're gruesome, and they're very graphic without actually pushing it that far, because it looks real. It's done practically and it looks good, so it's more sickening. But then you cut to this, and there's a guy flinging around a CG knife, and it's like slicing into people, and CG blood's flying everywhere, and a guy smashes a guy's head like a tomato, and CG blood goes everywhere. It just isn't that satisfying. It doesn't have that grounded punch to it, which is unfortunate, because again, that is like the point of the movie. So let's forget about the action. Let's talk about the movie itself, because it does operate like a regular movie. It isn't just action. And to its credit, it has a more streamlined, well-defined plot than either of the two other Mortal Kombat movies, especially the first one. The first one, again, is like just scenes happening almost at random. It's like nonsense, especially in the second act. This one, though, there's a very clear escalation of events. There's a very clear defined motivations to most of the characters, and there's very clear and defined character traits that are exploited or used to their benefit, which is similar to the first one. They have to overcome their one character trait, and that's sort of what happens here as well, but it is a lot more clear, it's a lot more defined, there's more motive behind what's happening, and it takes its time to set these things up, which I enjoyed. The first act isn't just like, hey, we're just gonna throw everything at the wall and hopefully you like it. It's essentially the same, like the setup to the plot of the first one. The first one, they get these collection of characters to go fight in Mortal Kombat, and the rest of the movie is Mortal Kombat. This one is, these characters are getting to Mortal Kombat. So it doesn't even really have that as a climax. Them fighting for the safety of Earth isn't the climax of the movie, it's them fighting Sub-Zero, which was fine, honestly. I actually liked that Sub-Zero was the main antagonist of this movie. It works pretty well, because in the originals, He's just there. A lot of the iconic characters from Mortal Kombat are just there, and they get dispatched very quickly.
On a mission in Brazil to capture a wanted fugitive. When we got there, it tore through our unit in seconds.
So the story's not great, the characters aren't great, things are more clear, they're more motivated, and the action is fun, but that's kind of it. That's the weird part about this movie is it has a lot going for it, and it seems to just trip itself at times. Like, the best parts of the movie are undercut by the worst parts of the movie. They're like, go hand in hand almost. The action is one of the best parts of this movie, and the visual effects are one of the worst parts of this movie. Not because they're bad, because it makes the action feel cheap. But then the characters are one of the worst parts of this movie, but their motivations are clearly defined, and they're actually sort of interesting, so they kind of undercut themselves. And the story is anticlimactic and stupid, but some of the beats in the stories work pretty well. So I don't know what this movie is. It's very odd. It's a very odd movie that I just don't know how to feel about it. I'd probably give it a 5. It's just kind of on. It's fun for a minute, but it's one I feel like I'm gonna forget a lot about. Like, I had to look up the main character's name because it's just so boring. And a lot of the other characters I only know because they're attached to Mortal Kombat and they're kind of cult or pop culture icons at this point. So it doesn't give you a great reasons to be invested in it. It doesn't give you great reasons to care. But if you just want to watch a violent movie and you don't care that a lot of the kills end with spectacular CGI bloodfests, it's fine.